Well, the world economy has undergone massive transformation with COVID-19. There's going to be an even bigger upheaval as climate change takes hold. So how do we prepare for the economic changes that that's going to bring about? The way of coping with the virus emergency has been unprecedented levels of government intervention. Does that mean the only way to a greener economy is through public funding, or can the private sector carry the can? And who manages the transition process? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Well, we don't know what the long-term structural change is going to be after COVID-19, but we do know that in the short term, it has helped IT firms and decimated tourism and hospitality. We know, for example, in the UK, for the 3 months to September, the hours worked in accommodation and food were 36% lower than the same period a year before, and that was supposedly after we came out of lockdown. But no change for the public sector and only 2% down for finance. It's not affecting those guys at all. But we do know we need to transition the global economy to adapt for climate change. And that is going to be an even bigger task. And hopefully we're going to stop it getting worse than it needs to be. So who manages the transition of an economy for things like this and things like climate change? Because when I think of an economy transitioning, Steve, I think of Margaret Thatcher closing down iron and steel and manufacturing, shifting from state-run to private industries, crushing unions. And that was a time when we saw unemployment, of course, rising up to 12%. I guess that's the hands-off approach, you could call it that. And maybe that's the way to do it. You have when you've got a big shift in an economy and how people are employed and the sorts of jobs they're employed in, maybe let the economy determine where the gaps are. Because if the government gets too involved, you get back to central planning and politicians picking the winners, which is never a good outcome. So, I'm in two minds on this as to which is the best way, genuinely, which is the best way forwards.
Well, it depends on what the actual crisis is, because if you have a financial crisis, then the government is the only institution which can produce money without having to make a profit from it, and you therefore have the government doing the rescue there. It's when we talk about a crisis, something that screwed up the market system. We have a vision of a market system behaving perfectly and being able to self-regulate and so on. And then when we call a crisis, it's normally when it absolutely fails to be the truth. And that was certainly the case with COVID. And we had governments at the time which were committed to austerity. There was a global tendency to try to cut back on government spending. And then, bang, this crisis hits. And in the middle of that, all these governments suddenly were worried about taxpayers' money, which, of course, it's not. Suddenly started turning on the government money creation capacity, which they had. We had all these schemes. I think it was called the Job Keeper in Australia and various things like that, the furlough scheme in the UK. And without those, you would have had a collapse of the private system, because there was nothing. You had people with financial commitments entered into before COVID hit, and then suddenly it's just like a 36% fall. That's actually quite modest, I think, for the entertainment and services.
Well, that was the months after the lockdown had finished. That's why. So that was that included the Eat Out to Help Out scheme and all that sort of stuff. So even with all that sort of stuff, it was still 36% down. But there's a big difference, isn't there, between the financial crisis, because the financial crisis in a way was an artificially created thing. Mankind created the finance system. Mankind didn't create this virus. So this is more of an existential threat.
Yeah, the funny thing is, neoclassical economics has a theory of what causes the business cycle that is actually blames it all on things outside the economy. Exogenous shocks. They're supposed to be shocks, what they call preferences and technology. So like unexpected innovations and unexpected people changing from, to wanting to have holes in their genes. And that's supposed to explain what causes fluctuations in the economy. In reality, the vast majority of the ups and downs of the economy are caused by its own internal dynamics, particularly the financial system.
Agreed.
This time, it actually is something that's come from, in a sense, outside the economy, and you can blame that COVID occurred on the sheer scale of human pressure on the biosphere, which is certainly the economy's fault. But in terms of the shock itself, it emanated from a medical cause, not from an economic or financial one. But virtually without fail, when these things hit, the market system fails and something else has to fill the gap, and that something else is the government. And unfortunately, we have an ideology. If I think of a pandemic, I think the real pandemic is the belief in mainstream economic theory, And that pandemic means that we fall back into the default position that there should be very little government intervention until the next crisis comes along, when, of course, we're not prepared for it because there wasn't enough government intervention.
Yeah. And then, of course, we start to pull back as well. So the longer this threat goes on, the less government money there will be, because we're already seeing people asking the questions about, well, where's this money going to come from? So Rishi Sunak, for example, tries to be a bit more cagey with money. Then we get a second wave and he goes, okay, we're going to start the furlough scheme again. But he was really trying to pull back because of that fear, because, money is limited and we've got to pay this back. And that was very much the philosophy, and very much the philosophy in mainstream society as well. How many times have you heard people saying, how are we going to pay for all of this?
And it's a false fantasy. This is is why the insights of modern monetary theory are so important, because the government's a money-producing system, and it produces money by running a deficit, and the deficit creates the reserves that are used to buy the bonds. It is not being... That lack of awareness is probably one of our major enemies, and again, that is something which has come out of mainstream economic thinking.
The counter-argument, though, to modern monetary theory is that if you create too much money, you're going to get inflation. But that is not good. But that only happens, of course, if you've got if you've got full employment, you've got maximum productive capacity. We're a long way off that,
which we're nowhere near.
So that isn't an issue this time.
And that's part of modern monetary theory accepts that. So we're imposing constraints that don't have to be imposed, and in fact make our response to things like this worse. And which is why I think I'd really prefer people to start thinking about COVID like I think about World War II. And that was something where the government ran deficits, in the American case of 30% of GDP, in the British case 40% of GDP, and the sky didn't fall in. In fact, the things falling out of the sky got to be less because there were British planes and American planes fighting off the German bombers. So it's our ideology that trips us up here. But in the transition itself, you have to have something which can take the place of the cash flows the market system normally provides. And that's what the furlough scheme and so on did. And then you take them away. If the crisis is still there, you fall back into the same trap once more.
Yeah, and of course that GDP is being helped by all that government spending as well. I mean, if you pulled out the government spending, your GDP would fall in a hole.
Yeah. And it's... so I think we have an enormous problem in coping with this, because we've got an ideology that leads us to not be prepared for events like this, which nonetheless, despite not being prepared for them, we're also aware they're likely to happen. So the awareness that there was going to be a pandemic is something which was first made popular by, I think it's Laurie Garrett, with a book called The Coming Plague, written back in 1994-95. And we know that the American government, particularly with long-lived institutions like the Center for Disease Control, established pandemic management units, pandemic planning units, and you have to have that long-term perspective. But they, of course, fall prey to the whole focus upon austerity and short-term budgets. Yeah. And then when the crisis comes along, we're not prepared at all. The ironic thing is, I think there was a WHO study a couple of years ago saying the two most prepared countries in the world for a pandemic were the UK and America.
Really?
Really?
And that certainly wasn't the case, was it? So that's been completely debunked. So on the medical research, I mean, the issue in the UK as well, similar story here. Basically the focus for medical research shifted from I think from about the 1980s or 90s to being research which could be commercialized. So there's not a great deal of commercial value in a pandemic, but for stuff that you can sell lots of drugs for over a long period of time, that can easily be commercialized. So that became the focus of public money, was acting as seed money for commercial enterprises, which didn't help at all.
Yeah, and I hope one thing which gets learned by this crisis, and hopefully ingrained to some extent, because I think you need to be traumatized before humans learn in any sustainable way in terms of how they set up their social institutions, is that we have to have institutions which are there for crises that are not going to be profitable to address in the short term. And so, the companies like Pfizer is going to make a large amount of money out of this crisis, but it's only because they can sell the vaccines they're producing to governments, distribute them for free. If they're not distributed for free, we won't get rid of the virus. So it's one of these cases where you simply know there is no market solution. And we have to get past this real intellectual pandemic of believing that there's such a thing as a self-regulating, always viable, always vibrant market economy. There simply isn't.
And yet Pfizer, are going to be producing it presumably under license. I mean, what about all those other companies that could be producing it if they gave away their IP? And are we? Is the economic system that we operate under going to control the distribution of a virus that could, that is going to help the global economy to get back to normal?
Yeah, well, we can't let that happen. I mean, if the vaccine is charged for, then there are people who can't afford it. Period. And because people can't afford it, there's a reservoir for the virus, which will come out again. And again, we're going to face the same thing multiple times in the coming decades, because the pressure we're putting on the biosphere is so great that we're butting up against all sorts of other animals which can have other pathogens, and we're saying, hey, why don't you move across to our species? There's many more of us, and we reproduce much more rapidly. All the other ones are declining. Why not come and invade us? It's virtually an invitation.
And the way we have managed to cope with tackling COVID-19 is that more authoritarian regimes like China, for example, with more centralized control, have been able to influence the population to behave in a way that was going to quash that virus, whereas Western nations, less so. So if we're going to tackle climate change, are we going to find that we have to move to a more centralized approach? And how is that going to go down in the West? To hear more of this discussion, become a subscriber to this podcast at debunkingeconomics.com, or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. And we'll see you back here again next week for another edition of the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Thanks for listening.